The blood had already begun to freeze in the snow when Winthera found him. She could never say afterward what made her stop that night. The worst blizzard in years, wind cutting like a blade, every instinct screaming at her to run inside and bolt the door. But she heard the wrong sound in the middle of the storm, a groan too low to be wind, too human to be ignored, and something in her simply refused to keep walking. Kneeling beside that man half buried in the snow, she had no idea she was saving the life of the most powerful king in the realm. She knew only that he was alive, for now, and that the mountain rarely gave back what it took. She had no idea that when spring finally melted the last snow of that winter, the man she'd saved without ever learning his name would come back down that same road, and this time, no snow would be left to keep them apart again. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. Winthera Ashgale had lived alone at the edge of the mountains long enough to know a storm's mood before the first flake touched ground. A particular stillness in the air, a certain gray weight pressing low over the peaks, the sheep growing restless in their pen an hour before the sky gave any warning. This storm had a different mood. Meaner, faster. "Move," she muttered to her flock, herding the last stragglers into the barn with quick, practiced hands, wind tearing at her cloak hard enough to sting her cheeks raw. By the time she'd bolted the barn door and turned toward her cabin, snow fell so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. That was when she heard it, a sound underneath the wind's howl, low and human, coming from somewhere near the tree line. She almost didn't stop, almost told herself it was branches creaking, or her tired mind playing tricks after a long day. But the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in her refused to walk past it. She found him half buried already, snow collecting in the folds of a torn, once fine cloak, blood dark and frozen along one side of his ribs. He was unconscious, breathing shallow, skin gone the pale blue-white of someone who'd been out in the cold far longer than any body could safely manage. "Absolutely not," Winthera said aloud, to no one, already crouching beside him. "You are not dying in my snow." Getting him inside took every ounce of strength she had, plus language her mother would have scolded her for. He was tall, taller than any man she'd met in the valley, and solid with muscle in a way that made dragging him through knee-deep snow feel like hauling a felled tree. By the time she got him through her cabin door and onto the floor before the hearth, her arms shook, and her breath came in ragged clouds. She built up the fire first, then set to work on the wound at his side, a deep gash, edges rough, made by a blade rather than any accident of terrain. Someone had done this to him. Someone had left him to die in a storm. "Well," she said, cleaning the wound with the calm, businesslike focus she'd learned from years of patching up her own scraped knees and her father's careless axe accidents before he passed. "Whoever you managed to upset, they weren't gentle about it." He didn't wake for 2 full days. She fed him broth in small, careful spoonfuls whenever his eyes fluttered half open, changed his bandages, kept the fire burning through nights so cold, her water bucket froze solid by morning, despite sitting only a few feet from the hearth. She talked to him sometimes, in the particular way people talk to someone who can't answer back, telling him about the sheep, about the storm still raging outside, about how her father used to say the mountain took what it wanted and gave back only what it felt like giving. "You're lucky," she told him on the second night, adjusting the blankets over his still form. "The mountain doesn't usually give back." On the third morning, he finally opened his eyes. They were gold, not amber, not hazel. Actual gold, bright even in the dim cabin light, and so startling that Winthera nearly dropped the bowl of broth she'd been carrying. "Where?" he rasped, voice wrecked from disuse. "Am I?" "My cabin? Edge of the Ashgale Valley, about 2 days' walk from the nearest town, assuming you can walk, which you currently can't." She set the bowl down and knelt beside him, studying the wound with a healer's practiced eye rather than any particular interest in his face, however striking it happened to be. "You've been out cold for 3 days. I found you half frozen near the tree line during the worst storm we've had in years." He tried to sit up, immediately regretted it if the sharp hiss of pain was any indication, and settled for propping himself against the wall instead. 3 days. Give or take. You want to tell me who put a knife in your ribs and left you in a blizzard, or should I guess? Something shuddered behind those gold eyes, guarded, the look of a man deciding in real time how much truth he could afford to share. "Bandits," he said finally. "On the mountain pass. I fought them off, but not before one got a lucky strike in." Winthera studied him for a long moment, unconvinced but unbothered enough to let it go for now. Bandits didn't typically leave clothing that fine on a man they'd robbed, and they certainly didn't typically miss the ring, plain, unadorned, but made of gold too pure for any common traveler, still on his finger. She noticed. She said nothing. "Fine," she said instead. "Bandits. What's your name, then, since I've spent 3 days talking to you without one?" He hesitated again. "Kyle. Just Kyle." No family name offered, no further explanation, and Winthera decided she didn't care enough to press. She'd lived alone long enough to respect a person's right to keep their own business their own. "Well, Kale," she said, rising to check the fire. "You're not going anywhere for at least another week. That wound needs to close, and the pass won't be clear of snow for longer than that." "I can't stay here a week." "You can, and you will, unless you'd like to test whether you can walk 2 days through snowdrifts with stitches barely holding your side together." She glanced back at him, unimpressed by the stubborn set of his jaw. "I've patched up enough farmhands to know pride doesn't heal wounds any faster than rest." Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, quickly buried beneath obvious pain and frustration. "You don't seem particularly concerned about housing a complete stranger." "I'm mildly concerned," Winthera admitted. "But you were unconscious and bleeding out in my woods. Seemed rude to just let you die there." "Most people would have left me, or reported me to the nearest garrison, hoping for a reward." "Most people around here don't have a nearest garrison for 2 days' walk," she said. "And I don't much care for rewards that come from other people's misfortune." He watched her with an expression she couldn't read, something between disbelief and quiet assessment, as though she were a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter this far from wherever he usually spent his days. "Thank you," he said finally, the words coming out stiff, unpracticed, like a man unused to saying them. "For pulling me out of the snow. I don't know many who would have bothered." "Don't thank me yet," Winthera said, turning back to the fire. "You've still got a week of my cooking ahead of you, and I'll warn you now, I'm a considerably better shepherd than I am a cook." The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Kale healed slowly, his strength returning in fits and starts, and Winthera found herself, against every instinct toward caution she'd built over years of solitary living, enjoying his company. He was sharp, quick with words, quicker with observations about her flock, her land, the small daily rituals of her isolated life, and there was something in the way he studied everything around him, like a man memorizing details he'd been missing for a long time. "You've never sheared a sheep," she said one afternoon, watching him attempt, with visible determination and less skill, to help her with the barn chores, despite her protests that his wound wasn't fully healed. "I've led armies," he said dryly, wincing as he straightened. "Sheep were never part of the training." "Armies," Winthera repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's an interesting thing for a bandit victim to have led." Something flickered across his face, the same guarded look from that first morning, before he recovered. "Figure of speech. I managed a small trading company. Occasionally had to negotiate with difficult men." She didn't believe him, not entirely, but she'd noticed something else too. The way he flinched, briefly, whenever she mentioned the nearest town, or asked idle questions about where exactly he'd been traveling from. He was running from something, and it wasn't just bandits on a mountain pass. But she let it go. The same way she'd let go of the ring, the fine cloth beneath his torn cloak, the way he carried himself even wounded like a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. Whoever Cale really was, she had a week left to find out. And despite every warning instinct telling her that mysteries wrapped in gold rings and fine cloth rarely stayed simple, she found herself, quietly and against her better judgment, looking forward to every single day of it. By the 5th day, Cale had stopped pretending he couldn't walk further than the hearth. Winthera caught him at the window, one hand braced against the frame, staring out at the unbroken white stretching toward the tree line with an expression she'd started to recognize. The look of a man doing math in his head, calculating distances and days, and what waited for him beyond her small valley. "The pass is still buried," she said, not looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. "You'll break an ankle before you make it a mile. I need to send word somewhere." "To who?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. She'd learned, over the past 5 days, that Cale's silences carried as much information as his words did, if you knew how to listen. "There's no messenger service out here," she said instead, letting him keep his secret. "Nearest post-rider comes through Thistlewick, and that's 2 days on a good road, which this isn't right now." "Then I'll wait," he said, though the words came out tighter than the situation seemed to warrant. She glanced over at him, studying the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept his back to the wall rather than the window, as if some old habit made him wary of open space behind him. "Whoever you're avoiding," she said, "they'd have a hard time finding you out here even if they were looking. Nobody comes to Ashgale Valley. Nobody's come here in 3 years, actually, except the miller's boy delivering flour twice a season." Something in his face eased, just slightly. "Good. That's good. You gonna tell me who's looking for you eventually, or should I keep guessing? I'm partial to runaway groom at this point. You've got that particular look of a man who left something behind rather than lost it to bandits." He actually laughed at that. Short, surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. "Not a groom." "Debtor then. Gambling debts. Very fine clothes for a man who apparently can't afford to pay what he owes. Also, not that. You're not giving me much to work with, Cale." "I know," he said, something almost apologetic in his voice. "I'm not trying to be difficult. There are things I can't explain yet. Not because I don't trust you. Because explaining them puts you in danger I don't think you understand." Winthera set down the bread dough, wiping flour from her hands, and studied him properly. Not as a patient, not as a curious mystery, but as a man carrying something heavy enough to bend his shoulders even when the wound itself had mostly healed. "Fair enough," she said finally. "I won't push, but you should know, whatever it is, you're safe here for now. That much I can promise." Something shifted in his expression. Gratitude, or something closer to disbelief that safety could be offered so plainly, without conditions attached. The blizzard broke on the 7th day, sun finally cutting through weeks of gray, and with it came the reality Winthera had been quietly avoiding, that Cale, healed enough to travel, had no reason left to stay. She found him in the barn that morning, sitting on an overturned bucket and watching her sheep with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "You're up early," she said, settling onto a hay bale nearby. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded toward the flock. "This one keeps staring at me, the gray one with the torn ear." "That's Bramble. She stares at everyone, thinks she's in charge." "Is she?" "Absolutely. The rest of them just haven't figured it out yet." Winthera pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, watching morning light spill gold across the snow outside the barn door. "Pass should be clear by tomorrow, probably. Miller's boy usually comes through within a day or two of the first real thaw." "I know," Cale said quietly. "I should go before then." Something in her chest tightened at that. Should you? I have obligations. People depending on me. I've already been gone longer than... He stopped, jaw tightening, biting back whatever detail he'd nearly let slip. Longer than I should have been. Right. She kept her voice light, refusing to examine why the thought of him leaving sat so uneasily in her chest. A week. She'd known the man a single week, tended his wounds because it was the decent thing to do, and somehow found herself dreading an empty cabin like it was already lost to her. Winthera. He said her name carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. I want you to know, this week, staying here. It's been... He trailed off, searching for words that seemed to elude him. I haven't had a week like this in longer than I can remember. No obligations. No one needing anything from me except help mucking out a barn I'm terrible at mucking out. You are terrible at it. I'm aware. A small, real smile crossed his face. But it's been good. This. Whatever this was. It doesn't have to be past tense, she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her then, something complicated moving behind those gold eyes. I wish that were true. Why isn't it? Because who I am outside this valley isn't simple, he said quietly. And I won't drag you into what waits for me once I leave. You deserve better than becoming collateral in someone else's war. The word landed heavy between them, war, and Winthera felt her earlier guesses about bandits and gambling debts crumble into something far more serious. War, she repeated slowly. That's not a word people use loosely. No, Cale agreed. It isn't. You're not just some merchant who ran into trouble on the road. No, he admitted, the single word carrying the weight of everything he still wasn't saying. She studied him for a long moment, the fine cloth beneath his torn cloak, the gold ring he still wore, the way he carried himself even now like a man accustomed to command rather than obedience, pieces she'd noticed all week, without letting herself fully assemble them into any real shape. You don't have to tell me, she said finally. I meant what I said. You're safe here regardless of what you are out there. Something in his face broke slightly at that. Relief, or something rawer, harder to name. You're remarkable, you know. Most people would have run the moment I mentioned war. Most people haven't spent a week watching you lose repeated arguments with my sheep, Winthera said, and was rewarded with another surprised laugh, warm and genuine. I've decided you're harmless. Sheep don't lie. High praise from sheep. The highest. Bramble's very selective about who she tolerates. They sat together a while longer, morning light warming the barn, and Winthera found herself, despite every warning instinct, unwilling to press further, content instead to simply enjoy whatever time remained before the mountain pass cleared, and whatever waited beyond it inevitably called him back. Stay through spring, she said finally, surprising herself. The pass clearing doesn't mean you have to leave the moment it does. Whatever's waiting for you out there, it can wait a little longer, can't it? Cale was quiet for a long moment. I shouldn't. That's not a no. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. No, he admitted. It isn't. Outside, the last of the storm clouds broke apart, sunlight spilling clean and bright across the valley, and Winthera felt something cautiously hopeful take root in her chest. The quiet, dangerous hope that whatever war waited beyond her mountains might, for just a little while longer, hold itself at bay. He stayed. Not the full spring, not at first, but 3 days became a week, and a week became 2, and by the time the last snowbanks had melted into muddy trickles down the mountainside, Winthera had stopped counting how long Cale had been sleeping in her spare room, stopped pretending she wasn't disappointed on the mornings he mentioned, quietly, that he should probably think about leaving soon. You said that yesterday, she pointed out, watching him attempt, with improving skill, to mend a section of fence the winter had knocked loose. I meant it yesterday too. And yet? "And yet," he agreed, hammering a post back into place with more force than necessary, "here I remain." She'd stopped asking about the war, stopped pressing for his family name, or where exactly he'd come from, or what waited for him once he finally worked up the nerve to walk the cleared path toward whatever life he'd left behind. It wasn't that her curiosity had faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, fed by small details she collected without meaning to. The way he sometimes woke gasping from dreams he refused to describe. The practiced way he checked every window before settling in for the night. The letter he'd once started writing and then burned, unfinished, in the hearth before she could ask who it was meant for. But she'd decided, somewhere in the quiet weeks of early spring, that she trusted him more than she trusted her own curiosity. Whatever Cale was hiding, she'd let him tell her in his own time, if he ever chose to tell her at all. "Bramble had her lamb," she called out one morning, weeks into the thaw, finding him already awake and dressed despite the early hour. "Come see. She's being insufferable about it." He followed her out to the barn, and Winthra watched something in his face soften entirely at the sight of the newborn lamb, wobbly and damp, pressed against its mother's side. "She looks smug," Cale observed. "She's earned the right. 4 lambs in 5 years, and she still acts like each one's a personal triumph." Winthra crouched down, running a gentle hand along Bramble's flank. "You want to hold her? The lamb, not Bramble. Bramble bites." Cale hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside her, and when she carefully transferred the small, trembling lamb into his arms, something crossed his face that Winthra hadn't seen before. A rawness, unguarded and startled, like the weight of new life in his hands had cracked something open he usually kept sealed. "I've never held anything this small," he admitted quietly. "Not once in my life." "Never?" "My life doesn't involve much of anything soft," he said, voice rough. "Meetings, council sessions, decisions that affect thousands of people I'll never meet, made in rooms that never see daylight." He looked down at the lamb, something aching and vulnerable in his expression. "This is different. This matters in a way I understand, immediately, without a dozen advisors telling me why it should." Winthra studied him carefully, pieces of the puzzle she'd been quietly avoiding suddenly demanding to be assembled. Council sessions, thousands of people. A war he wouldn't name, a title he clearly carried even in the way he moved through the world. "Cale," she said slowly. "Who are you, really?" He looked up at her, gold eyes steady despite the vulnerability still visible underneath, and for a long moment she thought he might finally answer honestly. Then the sound of hoofbeats, fast and urgent, cut through the morning quiet, and whatever he'd been about to say died in his throat. Both of them turned toward the sound, and Winthra felt her stomach drop at the sight of a rider cresting the hill above her cabin, armored, moving with the kind of urgency that never brought good news, a banner she didn't recognize snapping in the wind behind him. Cale went rigid beside her, the lamb still cradled in his arms even as every other part of him shifted into something harder, more alert. "Cale," she said quietly. "Who is that?" "My guard," he said, voice gone flat and careful in a way she'd never heard. "Which means they've finally found me. Which means, Winthra, that whatever you decide to believe about me in the next few minutes, I need you to trust that everything I'm about to tell you is true, even though I understand if you don't." The rider drew closer, and as he came into full view, Winthra watched him dismount with the kind of formal, practiced bow that only ever accompanied one particular kind of person. "Your Majesty," the rider said, breathless, dropping to one knee in her muddy yard. "Thank the gods. We feared the worst when you never returned from the pass." Winthra felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. 3 months of quiet companionship suddenly recontextualized by 2 simple words. "Your Majesty." She turned to look at Cale. No, not Cale, not really. And found him watching her with an expression of open, unguarded dread, as though her reaction mattered more to him in that single moment than anything the kneeling guard might have to report. "You're the king," she said slowly, the pieces finally assembling. "You're the Alpha King." "Yes," he said quietly, still holding the small lamb like it was the only steady thing left. "I am. And I should have told you the moment I woke in your cabin, instead of letting you fall in love with a man who doesn't fully exist." The word, love, landed between them heavier than anything else he'd said, and Winthera realized, with a jolt, that he wasn't wrong to name it. The guard's name, Winthera learned in the chaotic hour that followed, was Halric, and he had the particular exhausted look of a man who'd spent 3 months searching every mountain pass in the kingdom for a king. Everyone else had quietly begun to fear was dead. "The council's been managing in your absence," Halric reported, still catching his breath even as Kyle— No, she corrected herself, still struggling with the shift. Draven, his actual name delivered in the same breath as his title, paced the length of her small yard with the lamb still cradled against his chest, as though he couldn't bring himself to set it down. "Lord Ashvane has been pushing hard for a regency vote, citing your continued absence as evidence of incapacity or worse." "Ashvane," Draven said, something cold entering his voice. "Of course. He's gained support, Your Majesty. Nearly a third of the council now, largely from lords who benefit from the trade concessions he's promised should he secure the regency." Winthera stood at the edge of her own yard, feeling increasingly like a stranger in a conversation that had taken over her life without warning. 3 months. 3 months of shared meals and quiet mornings and a growing trust she'd let herself build brick by brick. And the entire time, the man sleeping in her spare room had been a king, hunted by whoever had put a blade in his side, with an entire kingdom's stability hanging on whether he lived or died in her snow. "I need a moment," she said finally, cutting through the tactical discussion with a bluntness that made both men turn toward her. Draven's expression shifted immediately to something apologetic. "Winthera." "A moment," she repeated, and walked into her cabin without waiting for a response, needing 4 solid walls between herself and the sudden, overwhelming reality that had just ridden into her yard. He gave her nearly 20 minutes before he followed, finding her at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "I should have told you," he said quietly, standing in the doorway rather than presuming to sit. "The moment I woke up and realized where I was, who'd found me. I told myself I was protecting you by not saying it. I think, if I'm honest, I was also protecting myself. Being just Kale for a little while, it was the first time in years anyone treated me like a person instead of a crown." "You let me fall for someone who doesn't exist," Winthera said, though the anger in her voice had already begun softening. "I let you fall for exactly who I am," Draven corrected gently, finally stepping fully into the room. "The title's just the part I usually lead with. You got the rest of me first, without any of the performance that usually comes attached." "I'm not sure that's a lie, Winthera. I think it might be the most honest anyone's seen me in years." She looked up at him, studying the same gold eyes, the same thoughtful face she'd spent 3 months learning to read. "Why were you out there? Really, not the bandit story." He pulled out the chair across from her, sitting slowly, weighing his words with care. "Lord Ashvane has spent 2 years building support for a regency, using every excuse my council would tolerate. My youth, my lack of an heir, my refusal to marry for political convenience rather than genuine choice. When I refused, once again, to consider his daughter as a match, he grew considerably less patient about waiting for legitimate opportunity." His jaw tightened. The attack on the pass wasn't bandits. It was his men, dressed to look like bandits, sent to ensure I never made it home from a routine border inspection. He tried to have you killed. He tried, and nearly succeeded, and would have succeeded if a stubborn shepherdess hadn't decided a dying stranger in her woods was worth saving. Something warm entered his voice despite the grim subject. "I owe you my life, Winthera. I've owed it to you since the first night, and I let 3 months pass without acknowledging that debt, because acknowledging it meant telling you who I actually was, and some selfish part of me wasn't ready to lose what we'd built before I had to become a king again. Winthera turned her teacup slowly, working through the tangled mess of emotions the morning had unearthed. What happens now? Now, Draven said, I have a regency vote to prevent, a would-be assassin to formally accuse before my council, and considerably less time than I'd like to figure out how to ask you to be part of what comes next, without it sounding like I'm repaying a debt rather than wanting you there. Something in her chest tightened at that. That's a lot to ask someone you've known 3 months. It is, he agreed. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm asking you to let me finish what I should have started weeks ago. Being honest with you about everything, and letting you decide from there whether any of it is something you actually want. She studied him for a long moment, the careful vulnerability in his expression, the way he'd waited at the doorway rather than presuming space that wasn't his to take. Start with Ashvane, she said finally. Tell me everything. If I'm going to decide anything about what comes next, I'd rather do it with the whole truth in front of me, rather than pieces I have to assemble myself. Relief crossed his face. Ashvane's father served my own father for decades, and when my father died and I took the crown at 19, Ashvane made it clear, in every way considered polite enough to survive council scrutiny, that he believed himself better suited to actual rule. He's spent 5 years positioning himself, building alliances, funding trade routes that benefit his allies over the kingdom broadly, waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity my absence has handed him. He rubbed a tired hand across his face. I've spent 5 years trying to rule fairly, trying to prove a young king could still be a good one, and it's been a lonelier fight than I expected. That sounds exhausting. It is. It was, rather, until 3 months ago, when I found myself worrying about whether I was mucking out a barn correctly and arguing with a sheep named Bramble about personal space, and discovering that I genuinely enjoyed an ordinary life I'd never once been permitted to have. He met her eyes steadily. I don't want to go back to being only a king, Winthera. I want to figure out how to be both. The man who held that lamb this morning, and the king who has to return and fight for his own throne. I don't know if that's possible, but I'd like to try, and I'd like you to be part of figuring out how, if you're willing. Winthera felt the last of her carefully guarded hurt begin to soften, despite every instinct telling her this was more complicated than anything she'd bargained for. I need time, she said honestly. Not to decide about you. About all of it. The crown, the war you're walking back into, what any of that would even mean for someone like me. Take whatever time you need, Draven said. I'm not leaving until Halrick's fully briefed me on Ashvane's position anyway, which should buy us at least a few more days. A ghost of a smile touched her mouth. A few more days of mucking out barns, Your Majesty. If you'll have me, he said, something warm and hopeful entering his voice. Though I suspect, given everything, you should probably start calling me Draven instead. I think, Winthera said slowly, testing the name, finding it fit considerably better than the careful Kale ever had. I'd like that. Halrick left the following morning, carrying a message Draven had spent half the night drafting, formal notice to his council that the king lived, that he intended to return within a fortnight, and that any regency vote conducted in his absence would be considered treason the moment he reclaimed his throne. That's a strong word, Winthera observed, watching him seal the letter with wax from a small kit Halrick had brought. It's an accurate word. Draven pressed his signet ring into the wax, the same gold ring she'd noticed that very first morning, and something about watching him use it now, deliberately, as a king rather than a mystery, felt different. She helped him prepare over the following days, mending the torn cloak he'd need for the journey, packing dried meat and hard bread, listening while he worked through strategy with Halrick, who returned briefly with fresh horses before riding ahead to alert the loyal portion of the council. It was during one of those strategy sessions, watching Draven pace her small kitchen while outlining how he intended to counter Ashvane's regency push, that Winthera found herself struck by how completely he'd transformed in the span of a single week. The guarded man who'd hidden behind vague answers about bandits now standing straighter, speaking with crisp authority, gold eyes sharp with calculation rather than the softer warmth she'd grown used to. "You're different," she said once Halric had ridden off again. "I'm more myself, actually," Draven said, pausing his pacing. "Or rather, this is also me. The king part. I haven't been pretending these past months, Winthera, but I also haven't been entirely whole, if that makes sense. Kale was real. Draven's real, too. I'm trying to figure out how both fit into the same person without one erasing the other." "That makes more sense than you'd think," Winthera admitted. "I'm not sure I'm only one thing either. Shepherdess, healer, sort of, by necessity. Occasionally very stubborn woman who drags strangers out of blizzards against her better judgment. That last one I'm particularly grateful for." She smiled despite the weight sitting heavy in her chest, the knowledge that within days he'd be gone, riding back toward a throne and a war she had no place in, however much 3 months of quiet companionship had convinced her otherwise. "When do you leave?" she asked, the question she'd been avoiding. 3 days, Draven said. "Halric thinks the pass will hold clear that long, and I can't afford to wait longer than that. Every day I remain absent is another day Ashvane consolidates support." 3 days, she repeated softly. "Winthera." He crossed the kitchen, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. "I meant what I said. I don't want this to be the end of whatever we've built. I know asking you to leave everything you know, to step into a world of council politics and assassination attempts and constant scrutiny, is asking more than any reasonable person should ask after 3 months. But I'm asking anyway, because the alternative, riding away and hoping you'll still be here whenever this war resolves itself, feels worse. You're asking me to come with you. I'm asking you to consider it," he corrected gently. "Not today. Not before you've had time to think through what that decision would mean. But eventually, yes. I want you there, Winthera. Not as some quiet secret kept separate from my crown, but as someone the entire kingdom knows chose to stand beside me. Exactly as you are." Winthera felt something in her chest ache at the sincerity in his voice. The vulnerability of a king who'd spent 5 years fighting alone, finally admitting he wanted a partner, rather than simply an heir-producing arrangement. "What would that look like?" she asked. "I'm not noble. I don't know the first thing about council politics, or court manners, or whatever else comes with standing beside a king." "Neither did I once," Draven said. "I learned. You could too, if you wanted to. Or we figure out something entirely different, something that doesn't require you to become anyone other than who you already are. I don't have all the answers yet, Winthera. I only know I don't want to leave here without at least asking the question." She was quiet for a long moment. 3 months ago, her life had been simple. Sheep, seasons, the quiet rhythm of a valley few people ever visited. Now a king stood in her kitchen, asking her to consider abandoning all of it for a life she couldn't fully picture, tangled up in politics and danger she'd never asked to be part of. "I need to think," she said finally. "Truly think, not just tell you what you want to hear because I'm frightened of watching you ride away." "That's fair," Draven said, though something in his expression suggested the answer cost him more composure than he let show. "Take the 3 days. I'm not going anywhere until then." The 3 days passed too quickly and too slowly, each morning bringing them closer to a departure Winthera found herself dreading more with every hour, despite every rational argument. On the final evening, she found him in the barn again, sitting on the same overturned bucket from that first week, watching Bramble's lamb, now steadier on its legs, wobble around the pen. "I've made a decision," she said, settling beside him. Draven went still. Tell me." "I can't come with you tomorrow," Winthera said, watching something fall in his expression before she continued. "But that's not the same as saying no. I have a flock that needs proper arrangements before I could leave for any length of time. I have a life here that I built alone over years, and I won't abandon it carelessly just because a king asked nicely, however much I've come to care about him." "I understand," Draven said, though the disappointment in his voice was plain. "I'm not finished," she said. "What I'm saying is, go. Fight your war. Reclaim your throne. And when it's settled, when Ashvane's threat is resolved and you're not riding back into my valley bleeding and half frozen, come find me properly. Court me the way you'd have courted anyone else, if we'd met under ordinary circumstances instead of a blizzard and a knife wound. Let me decide what I want once I'm not deciding it under the shadow of your war." Something in Draven's face shifted slowly into profound relief and gratitude. "That's more than fair," he said. "That's more patience than I probably deserve, given everything I've already asked of you." "You deserve the chance to prove this is real," Winthera said. "Outside of blizzards and secrets and stolen names, if what we've built is genuine, it'll survive you actually being a king for a while, rather than pretending to be an ordinary man hiding in my spare room." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the same gentle care he'd shown holding the newborn lamb. "I'll come back," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes. I'll settle this war, and then I'll come back for you, and I'll spend as long as it takes proving that everything you felt for Kale, you can feel just as fully for Draven." "I already do," Winthera admitted softly. "That's rather the problem. I fell for you before I knew your name, Draven. Whatever crown comes with the rest of you doesn't change that. It just means figuring out how both parts fit into what comes next." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she didn't, closed the remaining distance to kiss her. Gentle, unhurried, carrying 3 months of careful restraint, finally given permission. "Spring," he murmured against her lips. "I'll settle this by spring, and then I'm coming back for you properly, with less blood loss involved." "I'll hold you to that," Winthera said, something warm settling in her chest despite the uncertainty. "Now go save your kingdom, Your Majesty. I've got a flock to tend, and a very smug sheep who's going to miss arguing with you almost as much as I will." Draven left at dawn, riding out with Halric beside him and 2 additional guards who'd arrived overnight, and Winthera stood at the edge of her yard until the small party disappeared over the ridge. The valley felt emptier once he'd gone. She threw herself into work in the days that followed, mending fences, tending the flock, the ordinary rhythms of her life reasserting themselves with a persistence that felt, some mornings, like the only thing keeping her steady. But the cabin felt too quiet in the evenings, the spare room too obviously empty, and more than once she caught herself listening for a voice that wasn't coming. Word came slowly, carried by the miller's boy on his twice-monthly visits. Rumors filtered through market gossip in Thistlewick. "They're saying the king's back at the capital," the boy reported one afternoon. "Some kind of trial happening. Lord Ashvane's been arrested for treason, they say, though nobody seems to agree on exactly what he did." "Arrested?" Winthera repeated, something in her chest loosening. "Aye, big to-do about it. My cousin works kitchens at the garrison outpost. Says half the council's been in an uproar for weeks, splitting over whether Ashvane deserves execution or exile." The boy shrugged. "King's supposed to be handling it himself, is what they're saying. Refuses to let the council settle it without him standing in judgment." She thought about that for days, Draven, standing in judgment over the man who'd tried to have him murdered, carrying the weight of a decision that would shape his entire reign. She wished, uselessly, that she could be there beside him. The trial, when details finally reached the valley weeks later, painted a more complicated picture than market gossip had suggested. Ashvane confessed, the miller's boy reported, to everything. The attack on the pass, hiring the men who wore bandit colors, all of it. But get this, turns out his own daughter had no idea. She's been publicly grieving the whole ordeal, says she never wanted the throne through violence, refused every bit of support her father tried arranging on her behalf. Winthera found herself, unexpectedly, feeling a flicker of sympathy for a woman she'd never met, caught in her father's ambitions. What happened to him? Exile, the boy said. Permanent, stripped of every title and landholding, forbidden from ever setting foot within the kingdom's borders again. King wanted execution, from what my cousin heard, but the council argued him down to exile, said executing a lord for treason this early in his reign might make him look more tyrant than king. Winthera considered this. She could picture it. Draven's fierce anger at being nearly murdered warring against the measured judgment he'd need to actually rule well, a man caught between what he wanted and what leadership required. "Anything else?" she asked, trying to sound casual. The boy grinned. "Rumor says he's been asking after Ashgale Valley specifically, whether the roads are clear yet, whether the pass has fully thawed. My cousin thinks he's planning some kind of formal visit, though nobody officials said anything." Winthera felt her cheeks warm and busied herself unnecessarily with the flour sacks. "Just gossip, probably." "Probably," the boy agreed, entirely unconvinced, and left with a knowing smirk. Spring arrived properly in early April, the last snowbanks finally surrendering to steady rain and warming sun, wildflowers pushing through the softening ground, and Winthera found herself, more days than not, glancing toward the ridge where Draven had disappeared months before. She told herself she wasn't waiting. She had a flock to manage, fences that needed repair, a garden that demanded tilling. She told herself these things every morning with less conviction, as April stretched toward May without word. On an unremarkable Tuesday, elbow-deep in garden soil and unprepared for visitors, she heard hoofbeats on the trail. Not the urgent, frantic pace of Halrick's arrival months before, but something steadier, more deliberate. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and watched a single rider crest the ridge, sunlight catching against dark hair and a cloak finer than the torn, bloodied one she'd first pulled from the snow. Draven dismounted at the edge of her yard, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. 3 months of separation and rumors suddenly collapsing into the reality of him standing there, whole and present. "You came," she said finally, voice unsteady. "I told you I would." He crossed the distance between them slowly. "Ashvane's dealt with, the council's stable. I've spent these past months proving to every doubter that a young king can rule fairly and firmly." He stopped close enough that she could see every detail of his face, gold eyes steady and warm in the spring sunlight. "And now, as promised, I've come back for you." "Properly," Winthera repeated, a smile tugging at her mouth despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Does that mean you're planning to court me this time, instead of bleeding in my yard and hoping for the best?" "Less bleeding involved, yes." He reached into his cloak, producing a small bundle of wildflowers, slightly crushed from the ride. "I'm told this is traditional. Though I confess, 5 years of ruling a kingdom left me better prepared for war negotiations than courtship." Winthera took the flowers, laughing despite the tears now slipping down her cheeks. "You're doing fine so far, Your Majesty." "Draven," he corrected gently, echoing words she'd once offered him. "Just Draven if you'll have him. Crown and all, but Draven first." "Draven," she agreed softly, and let him pull her into an embrace that felt, finally, uncomplicated. Just 2 people, standing in a spring-warmed valley, choosing each other deliberately, as promised. He stayed a week that time, not healing from a knife wound, simply present, learning the rhythms of a life he'd once only glimpsed through the fog of injury and secrecy. "You're better at fence repair now," Winthera observed, watching him work alongside her. "Almost competent. 5 years of ruling a kingdom teaches a man to learn quickly, or watch things fall apart." Draven straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Though I confess, I've had more practice at council negotiations than carpentry. It shows. That post is crooked. It's rustic. It's crooked, Draven. He laughed, the sound easy and unguarded. This powerful, complicated man, capable of commanding armies and standing in judgment over traitors, reduced to genuine amusement over a badly hammered fence post. It was during that week that he finally told her everything he'd left unsaid. The full weight of Ashvane's betrayal, the difficult months of trial, the exhausting work of proving to a skeptical council that a king who'd nearly died could still rule with a steady hand. I almost lost everything, he admitted one evening, sitting beside her fire. Not just my life, my throne, my father's legacy, everything I've spent 5 years building. Ashvane very nearly succeeded. But he didn't, Winthera said gently. No, because a stubborn shepherdess decided a bleeding stranger was worth saving, despite every reasonable argument against it. He reached for her hand. I've thought about that constantly. How close I came to dying in your snow, unremarked, if you'd made a different choice. I don't regret the choice, Winthera said. Though I confess, I didn't expect it to come with quite so much political complexity. Most rescues don't, Draven agreed. You got rather more than you bargained for. I got exactly what I needed, actually, she said softly. I didn't know I was lonely until you weren't here anymore. 3 years alone, and I told myself I was content. Then you left, and the whole place felt hollow. Something in Draven's expression shifted, warm and vulnerable. I felt the same, riding back toward the capital. Every strategy session, every council meeting, some part of me kept wondering what you'd think of it. He squeezed her hand. I've never had that before. Someone whose opinion mattered to me beyond politics or duty, just because it was yours. On his final morning before returning to the capital, Draven found her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with seeds she'd been saving all winter, and settled beside her without a word. I have a proposal, he said, and I want you to know up front that you're allowed to say no, and a no won't change anything about how often I intend to keep visiting this valley. Winthera sat back on her heels. That's an interesting way to open a proposal. I'm trying to remove pressure, he said, because what I'm about to ask is larger than anything reasonable to expect an answer to immediately. Ask anyway. He took a breath. Come to the capital, not forever, not yet, but visit. Let me show you the parts of my life I haven't been able to share here, in this valley, where everything's been simple and quiet. I want you to see the whole picture before you decide anything permanent. And if I hate it? Then we figure out something else, Draven said. I meant what I said. I'm not interested in a life that requires you to become someone else. If court life isn't for you, we find another arrangement. But I'd like you to at least see it, before deciding it's not for you sight unseen. Winthera considered this, the seed still cradled in her palm, the familiar weight of her valley around her. All right, she said finally. I'll visit. No promises beyond that. No promises beyond that, Draven agreed, relief evident. Though I should warn you, my counsel's curious about the shepherdess who apparently captured a king's heart during a blizzard. You may find yourself something of a novelty. Wonderful, Winthera said dryly. I do so enjoy being a novelty. You'll manage beautifully, Draven said, leaning over to press a gentle kiss to her temple. You managed a wounded, secretive king without once being intimidated. Court politics should prove less dangerous than that. I wouldn't be so sure, Winthera said, though she found herself smiling despite the uncertainty. Politics have a way of being more dangerous than blizzards, from what I understand. Fair point, Draven admitted. Though this time at least you'll have me beside you, rather than facing the whole ordeal alone. They sat together in the garden a while longer, spring sunlight warm overhead, and Winthera found herself, despite every uncertainty, looking forward to what came next. Not because fate or circumstance had decided it, but because she'd chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, to find out. The capital was nothing like Winthera had imagined. She arrived a month after Draven's proposal, traveling with a modest escort he'd insisted on despite her protests. The city sprawled larger than anything she'd ever seen, towers and rooftops stretching toward a horizon she couldn't make out, streets crowded with more people than her entire valley had seen in a decade. "You look overwhelmed," Draven observed, meeting her at the gates himself. "I look like a woman who spent 3 years talking mostly to sheep, surrounded by more people than exist in my entire valley," Winthera said. "Give me a moment to remember how crowds work." He laughed, offering his arm with a formality that felt strange after months of muddy barns and shared fence repairs, and led her through streets that gradually quieted as they approached the castle. Though the quiet came with its own tension, servants and courtiers pausing to stare, whispers trailing in their wake. "They're curious," Draven said. "Wonderful," Winthera muttered. "I do love being gossip fodder." "You'll get used to it," he said, though something in his tone suggested he understood how uncomfortable that adjustment could be. The council session, when it came 2 days later, proved more nerve-wracking than Winthera had braced for. A long chamber full of stern faces, some curious, some openly skeptical. "Miss Ashgale," said an older woman near the head of the table, sharp-eyed and clearly influential. "I understand you saved His Majesty's life during the winter storms." "I did," Winthera confirmed, "though I confess I didn't know who I was saving. Would have done the same for anyone I found dying in my woods." "An admirable instinct," the woman said, something almost approving crossing her features. "Though I wonder whether admirable instinct alone qualifies someone for the responsibility that comes with standing beside a crown." "Lady Farrenwick," Draven said, a warning edge entering his voice. "It's a fair question, Your Majesty," Winthera interrupted. "I don't have noble blood. I don't know council politics, or court etiquette, or half the things I imagine matter to people in this room. What I do know is how to keep a household running through brutal winters, how to make difficult decisions when resources run thin, how to tend something wounded and keep it alive against odds." She met Lady Farrenwick's gaze directly. "I imagine those skills translate more usefully to ruling a kingdom than you might assume." Silence followed, until Lady Farrenwick's expression shifted into something like respect. "Perhaps they do, at that. I withdraw my concern for now. Time will tell the rest." The session continued more smoothly after that, though Winthera left exhausted. "You handled that remarkably well," Draven said that evening, finding her on a private balcony overlooking gardens more elaborate than anything she'd tended. "I felt like I was defending my entire existence to a room full of strangers," Winthera admitted. "Is it always like that?" "Often, yes," he said honestly. "Though it does ease. Lady Farrenwick's actually one of my more reasonable advisors. You should have seen Ashvane's questioning." "Comforting," Winthera said dryly. Draven moved to stand beside her. "I know this is more than what you agreed to, visiting for a few weeks. If it's too much—" "I didn't say it was too much," Winthera interrupted. "I said it was exhausting. Those aren't the same." She turned to study him. "I spent 3 years thinking I'd built a full life alone in that valley. Turns out I was just surviving it, rather than living it. This," she gestured at the sprawling castle grounds, "is terrifying and overwhelming and more complicated than sheep and fence repairs. But it's also the first time in years I've felt genuinely challenged, rather than enduring another quiet, solitary season." "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of court life," Draven said, though warmth colored his voice. "It's an honest one," Winthera said. "I'm not saying I'm ready to abandon my valley, or that I've suddenly transformed into someone comfortable with rooms full of judging nobles. But I don't want to retreat back to easy solitude either. Not anymore. Not when the alternative is this." She gestured between them. "Whatever we're building, complicated and difficult as it sometimes proves. Draven reached for her hand. Then we build it slowly, he said. However long it takes. Your valley remains yours, whenever you need to retreat there. But I'd like to think we're building something here too, that eventually feels like home in both places. Both places, Winthera repeated softly, something settling warm in her chest. I think I could manage that. The autumn brought its own trial, one Winthera hadn't anticipated. There's been talk, Lady Farrenwick said, finding her in the castle library. Regarding the succession. Winthera looked up from her book. What kind of talk? The kind that suggests His Majesty should consider a match with more obvious political benefit, now that Ashvane's threat has settled and stability's been restored. Lady Farrenwick settled across from her. Several lords have begun suggesting alternative candidates, women with proper lineage, useful alliances, the sort of match that traditionally accompanies a king's marriage. Something cold settled in Winthera's stomach. What does Draven say? He's dismissed every suggestion outright, rather forcefully, in at least 2 instances. A ghost of approval crossed Lady Farrenwick's features. I'll admit, I was among those who initially doubted whether a shepherdess without noble blood could suit a king's needs. I've since revised that opinion, watching you these past months. But I thought you should know the whispers exist, so you're not caught unprepared. Winthera absorbed this. Thank you. You've earned more respect from this council than I expected, Lady Farrenwick said, rising. Don't let a handful of nervous lords convince you otherwise. But the whispers, once noticed, proved difficult to ignore, and Winthera found herself, in the weeks that followed, watching Draven more carefully, searching for any sign the pressure might be wearing at his certainty. She found him one evening in his private study, surrounded by trade documents, looking more tired than she'd seen him in months. You've heard then, he said, not looking up. Lady Farrenwick has never been particularly subtle. I've heard, Winthera confirmed, settling into the chair across from his desk. I want you to be honest with me, Draven. If this is becoming too complicated... It's not, he said, setting down his quill. Winthera, I nearly died in a blizzard because Ashvane decided my refusal to marry for political convenience made me vulnerable. I spent 5 years before that watching every relationship I might have built get steered by advisors convinced only strategic marriage could secure my throne. I am not interested in repeating that mistake. But if it threatens the kingdom... It doesn't, Draven said firmly. The kingdom's stability comes from good governance, fair judgment, and a council that trusts my decisions because I've proven repeatedly that I make them carefully. It doesn't come from marrying whichever noble daughter offers the most convenient trade alliance. He came around the desk, kneeling beside her chair. I chose you, Winthera, not because you offered political advantage, but because you saved my life without knowing who I was, and then continued choosing me, deliberately, every single day since, without once asking what you might gain. That's worth more to me than any lord's approval. Something in Winthera's chest loosened. I appreciate that. I do. But Draven, I need you to understand, I'm not asking because I doubt your feelings. I'm asking because I've watched, these past months, how much weight your decisions carry. If choosing me destabilizes something important... It won't, he interrupted gently. I promise you it won't. Lady Farrenwick's already come around, and she carries more influence than most of the lords currently whispering. The rest will follow eventually, once they see what I already know. What's that? That you make me a better king, Draven said simply. Not despite being different from what tradition expected, but because of it. You ask questions the rest of my council's too cautious to raise. You see solutions grounded in practical experience rather than theoretical politics. Half the reforms we've discussed implementing this past season came directly from conversations with you. Winthera felt tears prick at her eyes, old fears slowly easing. I love you, she said quietly. I don't think I've said that plainly yet. You haven't, Draven agreed, something soft crossing his features. Though I confess, I rather hoped it was implied, given you've spent months navigating court politics you never asked for, simply to remain close to me. I love you, she repeated, crown and complications and nervous lords included. He rose, pulling her gently to her feet. I love you too, he murmured against her hair. I have, I think, since somewhere around the third day of arguing with you about whether I was well enough to help with barn chores. You were absolutely not well enough. I was extremely stubborn about it. She laughed, and found Draven watching her with such open devotion that her doubts settled into quiet certainty. Marry me, he said suddenly, not because any lord demands it, not because tradition requires it, because I want to spend the rest of my reign and my life building this, whatever this is, with you specifically, and no one else. Winthera felt her breath catch. That's a rather unplanned proposal, Your Majesty. I've never claimed to be particularly skilled at romantic timing, Draven admitted. Ask my first attempt, with crushed wildflowers and less eloquence than the moment deserved. I liked that attempt. Then perhaps you'll like this one too. He took her hands in his. Marry me, Winthera. Properly, publicly, regardless of what lords whisper. I want the entire kingdom to know exactly who chose to stand beside their king, and why. Winthera looked at him for a long moment, the guarded stranger she'd once pulled bleeding from her snow, now standing before her entirely open, entirely certain. Yes, she said finally. Yes, absolutely yes. The wedding took place in early winter, exactly 1 year after Winthera had first dragged a bleeding stranger out of a blizzard, and she'd insisted, against council protest, that at least part of the ceremony honor where their story had begun. You want sheep at a royal wedding? Lady Farrenwick said, her tone between disbelief and amusement. One sheep, Winthera corrected. Bramble. She's practically family, and I refuse to get married without at least one guest who witnessed the beginning of this entire mess. The kingdom's nobility will find it eccentric. The kingdom's nobility already finds me eccentric, Winthera pointed out. I might as well commit fully to the reputation. In the end, Lady Farrenwick relented, though she insisted on ceremony around Bramble's brief appearance. The morning arrived crisp and clear, the first proper snowfall dusting the castle gardens in white. Nervous? Lady Farrenwick asked, helping fasten the final clasps on a gown simpler than court fashion typically demanded. Pale blue wool rather than elaborate silk. Terrified, Winthera admitted. Not about marrying him, about everything after. Being queen properly, not just visiting. You've managed more than most nobles born to the role, Lady Farrenwick said. I confess, when you first arrived, I doubted whether you'd survive a single council session without losing your temper or your nerve. You've done neither, not once in over a year. High praise from you. Earned praise, Lady Farrenwick corrected. Now stop stalling. The ceremony passed in a warm blur. Vows exchanged beneath a flower-draped arch, Draven's voice steady as he spoke words he'd clearly considered, Winthera's own vows carrying quiet conviction. I once believed, Draven said, gold eyes bright, that a king's heart mattered less than a king's duty. You taught me those things aren't opposites. You taught me that choosing genuinely, without political calculation, creates something stronger than any strategic match. I choose you. I chose you the moment I woke in your cabin and found someone who'd saved a stranger's life expecting nothing, and I've chosen you again, every single day since. Winthera felt tears spill as she spoke. I spent 3 years alone, believing that quiet, solitary life was enough. You taught me otherwise, not by asking me to abandon who I was, but by showing me I could be exactly myself, stubborn sheep arguments and all, in a life bigger than I'd imagined possible. I love you, Draven. Not the crown, though I've grown to respect the weight you carry. You, specifically, When Draven finally kissed her, the assembled crowd erupted into warm celebration. The celebration stretched late, and during a quiet moment, Winthera found herself approached by Ashvane's daughter. "I wanted to offer congratulations," the woman said. "I know it's strange, given everything. I understand if you'd rather I hadn't approached." "You're not your father," Winthera said gently. "I don't hold his choices against you." Something in the woman's composure eased. "Thank you. I've spent this past year rebuilding whatever reputation his actions left me, and it's been—" She trailed off. "Lonely, mostly. Watching you build something so genuinely happy, despite everything my father tried to prevent, it gives me hope." "It doesn't have to end where his ambitions left it," Winthera said firmly. "You get to choose your own path now." "That's rather the whole point." The woman offered a small, genuine smile before returning to the edges of the celebration. Halric found her next, several glasses of wine having loosened his formal composure. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said. "His Majesty, married to a shepherdess who once threatened to have me mucking out barns." "I remember that conversation," Winthera laughed. "You were remarkably bad at hiding your nerves that first week." "In my defense, I'd spent 3 months convinced my king was dead," Halric said. "Finding him alive in some remote valley arguing with sheep was rather a lot to process." "Thank you," Winthera said, "for finding him, for everything you did." "It was my honor," Halric said. "Watching him these past months, happier than I've seen him in the 5 years I've served, that's been worth every difficult day." It was near midnight when Draven found her at the edge of the garden. "You disappeared," he said, settling beside her. "I needed a quiet moment. It's been rather a lot." "Regrets?" "None," Winthera said firmly. "Just processing how far we've come." "I think about that constantly," Draven admitted. "How close everything came to never happening at all." "But it wasn't," Winthera said. "And here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, threading his fingers through hers. "About that," Winthera said. "I've been thinking. I don't want to abandon the valley, even once we're fully settled here." "I wouldn't ask you to," Draven said. "I rather thought we might maintain it, a place to retreat to when court politics grow heavy, somewhere that remains ours." "I'd like that," Winthera said softly. "Somewhere Bramble can retire." "An excellent use of royal resources," Draven said, and Winthera laughed, leaning into his shoulder. "I love you," she said, watching snow fall softly around them. "I love you too," Draven said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "For the rest of whatever life we build together, wherever we choose to build it." Epilogue. 5 years later, Winthera stood at the edge of her old valley, watching Bramble, older now, slower, thoroughly retired, graze contentedly in the same pasture where everything had begun. The kingdom had settled into steady prosperity. Draven's reign now widely regarded as fair and thoughtful, his council strengthened by reforms Winthera herself had helped shape. "You're smiling at the sheep again," Draven said, joining her at the fence. "I'm smiling at how much has changed," Winthera said, "since a stubborn shepherdess decided a dying stranger was worth saving." "The best decision either of us ever made," Draven agreed, pulling her close as autumn sunlight spilled warm across the valley that had become the foundation of everything they'd built together.